Hi, everyone. Welcome to the session where we introduce Kristin Plys's book, Brewing Resistance, Indian Coffee House and the Emergency in Postcolonial India, and join the author as she talks to Ania Loomba. Kristin teaches sociology at the University of Toronto, and Ania is a professor of English at the University of Pennsylvania. Thank you very much, Ania, for agreeing to be part of the session today. Thanks a lot to everyone for logging in today, even though we know it's slightly early for those in the West and perhaps a little late for those in the East. I have the book with me. It's lovely, bright, and radiant yellow and holds together a rich and a highly informative historical account. And I'm showing it to everyone today here because it's rather unfortunate the author has not had a chance to look at the physical copy as yet. It's available on cambridgecore.org. It's available on Amazon for purchase as a Kindle edition worldwide. And the physical copy is available in India, and the international release is scheduled for the first week of August. We are very excited to host this session and talk about Kristin's book, not only because we feel that it's highly relevant for present times, but also because we are very eager to sort of interact with each other, interact with our readers, because we want to really challenge the barriers that the pandemic has suddenly thrust upon us. I think we're still navigating the vast and the very often tricky terrains of the digital world, which obviously makes it challenging, but even more motivating to host such events. Publishing thrives because engagement of readers, it's because of actually the engagement of readers. And once again, we are very happy that all of you have joined us today. A little bit about the agenda for the program. We begin by Ania sharing her thoughts about the book, and then we move on to a discussion, which is sort of a Q&A between the author and herself. We will end with Kristin's comments, followed by taking questions from the audience. So please feel free to let us know your thoughts through the session in the chat box and post any questions or issues that you would like either Ania or Kristin to address. May I now request Ania to begin the session? Thank you.
Yeah, hi. Thank you, Kutsia. Thank you, everyone. Hello for joining us. I am very happy to be talking with Kristin about this wonderful book, which for so many reasons is really timely. And it goes back to a crucial moment in the history of post-colonial India, a period which has not received as much attention as it should have, and which has crucial resonances today. I was 20 years old when the emergency broke. And although I was just starting to grasp Indian politics, we knew that India would never be the same again. Kristin situates the emergency in the dynamics of post-colonial states, and she uses Fanon's insight in The Wretched of the Earth as a touchstone. And this is the quotation from Fanon. In certain developing countries, therefore, they are quick to catch on and realize 2 or 3 years after independence, their hopes have been dashed. What was the point of fighting if nothing was really destined to change? Kristin deftly outlines how hopes were dashed after India's independence, honing in on the years just preceding the emergency. And she offers both a wide-angled view and very detailed analysis of these crucial developments. On the eve of emergency, she writes, 4 significant new left movements marked attempts to enact the radical aims of national liberation that, in the 2 or so decades since Indian independence, had not yet been realized. The Naxalite movement in West Bengal, the Dalit Panthers in Maharashtra, the Bihar movement, and the railway workers' strike. These movements both precipitated the emergency and, in the face of state repression, fomented resistance against the post-colonial state. And then she tells us that these left movements were accompanied by religious right-wing movements, Akali Dal, Jamaat-e-Islami, and the Rashtriya Swayamsevak Sangh, both left and right social movements of the 70s. She describes how they posed challenge to the economic development policies of the Indira Gandhi administration and the dislocations. Now, I mean, it's a pretty formidable task to do this and to show how the developments on the right and on the left were braided together in this period. The Jansang, she reminds us, sought access to mainstream politics, which while still maintaining its RSS identity. And she traces how this process intersected with the rise of Jayaprakash Narayan and the student agitation in Bihar. And she also traces how at the same time the left was fragmenting. And she does that by really I found that one of the most fantastic sections to read, what the complex knot of politics that was represented by the railway strike. And, you know, if you grew up in that period as I did, we followed in real time the very complicated maneuvers between the state and different factions of the labor movement, which Kristin beautifully details for us. And here's what she says. She says the militancy of railway workers was a response to deteriorating economic conditions in 1973, but it also marked an accumulation of decades worth of grievances, including absolute and relative decline in income in the decades leading up to the strike. And as she points out, you know, the labor laws had not changed from the British days. And, you know, workers were asked even to take lower wages, give up the right to organize and to strike. And one of the most, you know, I think brilliant sections is to show Nehru's double fences on the question of labor rights, on the question of socialism, which now looking back, we tend to think of him as so much perhaps more unmitigatedly, uncomplicatedly progressive than he really was. And she details how from the beginning, the state treated the strike as a political challenge to the authority of Indira Gandhi's prime ministership and not as an industrial relations issue. And we could talk about this later. But this thick description of India's post-colonial crisis is accompanied by an equally rich account of the emergency itself, with its massive arrests, a total of, you know, 108,000 political prisoners were illegally detained. I had a friend in prison through the time, so her evocation of what was going on was really brilliant, I thought. The clampdown of press freedoms, the slum demolitions, and the forced sterilization movement. But I think the discussion of MISA, the draconian MISA, and ISA, the Abatement of Internal Security Act, and the JNU struggle, student struggle, and repression on campus has special resonance with what we are seeing now and what we've seen more recently. And I remember when my, you know, friends I know were arrested, the most terrifying thing was to realize that there was not going to be no case. There was going to be no actual trial, no hope of anything like a free trial. But what is unique about the book, of course, is the fascinating history and theorizing of the Indian coffee house, which was such an important part of our cultural landscape. None of us knew really what Kristin traces, that the Indian coffee house began as a colonial firm formed by a group of plantation owners, and that during the independence struggle, it was occupied by the CPI affiliated workers. And on the 10th year anniversary of Indian independence, 15th August 1957, she writes that the Indian coffee house workers officially took ownership of the coffee houses and ran them as a cooperative under the slogan, "The coffee houses we work in belong to us." It is no mean feat to provide a comprehensive and yet nuanced picture of these complicated years when new configurations and alliances sprang up, and also new divisions. Her actual analysis of the resistance during the emergency favors the socialists, and yet she's sharp in her understanding of the differences between them and the communists. And I'm just going to read out a paragraph which for me encapsulates the way in which she manages to bring a wealth of detail into, you know, supposedly simple statements, but we know how much work and thinking has gone behind those statements. She writes, while the communists looked outward to creating linkages with the USSR and with the rest of the third world or colonized world, the socialists looked inward and placed a priority on creating an Indian and Hindu movement based on a leftist reading of Gandhian philosophy. So while the communists rejected religion and caste and saw as their objective the empowering of the working and peasant classes, the socialists celebrated the caste system along with their Hindu identity, and their objective was to restore and maintain an idyllic, cooperative, simple village life within India. So while the communists missed a lot of the nuances of how caste and communal issues impact Indian politics and society through their emphasis on class, the socialists' idealized view of Indian village life and reverence for Gandhian philosophy, which resulted in casteism and anti-Muslim sentiments. And I think this history is particularly important because the polarization looks different today, and many of the nuances, many of these positions you would now attribute, to other players. So it's really important to see how they fed into the current kind of polarization. And it is her understanding of the coffee house movement, and I'm going to, hopefully ask her for some follow-up discussion on that. She says that the most profound insight we gain from analyzing the trajectory of the Indian coffee house workers movement is not about state regulation of enterprise, but that the rationale for this protracted struggle against both the colonial and the post-independence Indian state is because what the Indian coffee house workers were waging was an ideological class struggle over the ideas of development. The Indian coffee house workers, as members of the CPI, had a specific idea of how economic development should take place in independent India, and their struggle was about that conflict. And what she does is to connect this history with the coffee house as an everyday place, the coffee house where people across the political spectrum met, discussed ideas, and then eventually became somewhat of a conduit for the resistance. So she says that, the kind of space that was made possible by the coffee house owed it, the uniqueness owed itself to the political struggle that had preceded the setting up of the coffee house as this kind of institution. So she says it was an autonomous zone, a socio-political space that served as an informal social center, a nodal point of communication, an exchange of protest materials, and a link among different groups. This is the space that is the main terrain of the book, and it provides a very rich ground for discussion and debate. I'm going to end there, and I did not want to talk about this main terrain because I think that is exactly what Kristin can talk about and that we can discuss. And there are, I think, many questions that come to mind. And so whenever you like, Kristin, I can start off with questions, or you can add to what I have said, and then I can follow up with questions, whatever you like.
Perhaps we can start with the questions, if that works for you.
Yes, I mean, I ended on, by this wonderful formulation of yours of the coffee house being an autonomous zone. So can you tell us more about your ideas about what is an autonomous zone and how exactly did the coffee house function as one? That's one part of the question. And the other part is, what implications does the idea of an autonomous zone have for us today?
Thanks so much, Ania, for all of the comments and for that, really fabulous summary of the book. So I think we will kick off the discussion with this question of autonomous zones. And one of the things that I think is pretty interesting about the way that, I've been thinking about autonomous zones in the context of the book is that there is a range within the political spectrum of how, of some of the cooperatives that feature in the book are much more sort of revolutionary, and others are a bit more conservative. So for example, the Sarvodaya cooperatives that were part of the Bihar movement in particular were part of this, the socialism that did have a lot of, I guess, issues around casteism and communalism. And then there are, you know, a discussion, particularly in putting it in a global context, of cooperatives that are more in this sort of anarcho-syndicalist tradition that seem to be a bit more revolutionary, particularly in opposing moments of fascism. And so we see sort of in the way that the CPI Undivided Indian Coffeehouse Workers Movement takes on this idea of the cooperative is sort of in this further left tradition. And they're also very ambivalent about whether or not they want to pursue that route, because they're sort of looking to this Soviet model of what a developed communist society might look like. And frankly, the rank and file of the workers after the coffee houses are cooperativized are really upset about this outcome. And they see this as a failure to really enact the kind of state socialism that they wanted to see in India. But what's kind of interesting, I think, about the way that this then develops is that it becomes this really key space during the emergency for people of different groups to sort of gravitate to and then launch this resistance through a broad-based coalition of left and right. So it is a model of politics that both sort of the more moderate parts of the left, but even the right can kind of gravitate towards. And I think that it does have a lot to offer the contemporary moment as well. And so, as I think a lot of us who are involved in left politics in the moment have learned through the course of the pandemic, is that it does become rather difficult to organize when you don't have rooms for face-to-face interfacing with different groups. And there's definitely limits to Zoom, for example, because these are spaces that are subject to surveillance. And so it seems difficult to imagine a way in which there's a way to sort of phase out face-to-face interactions. And we can think also in the case, I guess, of the Arab revolutions in 2011, when a lot of popular media commentators were discussing the role of social media in organizing revolution. But we also know that, for example, in Cairo, cafes were really important during the Egyptian revolution. And in Tunis, for example, public art installation and art performance were a lot of spaces in which people were organizing. So there are still these analog spaces that become really important in moments of state repression, but it also helps to bring in the uninitiated into social movement activism. So there were a lot of people in the 70s in India who might not have been super involved in the left, but through the kind of attraction of the coffee house would then become more engaged in politics through just wanting to be a part of a space that attracted artists and intellectuals. So yeah.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, you call it a movement. You know, towards the end of your book, you call it the coffee house movement. But you also talk about it earlier as a space for all kinds of people to come together. And is there not a tension between a movement and just an autonomous zone where everybody comes together? So is this a sort of something that happened over a period of time that you could actually call it a movement during the emergency? Or is there a difference between an autonomous zone and a movement? How would the two intersect or not intersect?
Yeah, no, I think that that's a really interesting and important question to sort of tease those two concepts out. And so the way that I see it is that as soon as left intellectuals and playwrights and other figures, creative figures, started to gravitate towards the coffee house, I think that's when it becomes an autonomous zone, because it's a way that different groups are exchanging ideas, envisioning utopian futures, whether it's through sort of what is the ideal role of a playwright in independent India, or sort of, having debates between different sort of political parties and groups. But I think that it became a movement when these groups sort of came together to oppose the emergency, because there really was this way in which the coffee houses in particular were really crucial in fostering resources for various party's movements against the emergency. So I guess one of the more extreme examples is that the coffeehouse workers created a network through which bomb-making materials were brought to Delhi in order to facilitate what would become the Baroda dynamite conspiracy. And so that to me seems more like tipping into the point of a movement where there is this concerted organization towards a specific end. And so I think that we need to think about this over time. And I think that there's some moments in the history of the Indian coffee house where it's simply an autonomous zone and not much more. But I think in the heat of the emergency, it becomes a movement in 75 into 76 until it's bulldozed.
We can come back, I think, to the question of autonomous zone in a while, but what's remarkable in reading your book is that this seems to be a very male autonomous zone and a very male movement. And, you know, the Indian women's movement was really galvanizing itself to enter a new phase in some ways during this period. But it doesn't find much of a mention in your book because I guess it's not anywhere linked to the processes that you're describing. Is that indeed the case? And could you comment on you know, the fact that women seem to be absent? They're not absent as players in, let's say, in the trade unions. You mentioned a couple of people, Parvati Krishnan and others, who are part of the railway workers movement. They're also present in student politics, but at the same time, they're not major players in the autonomous zone. Could you comment on that?
Yeah. No, this is one of the questions that I think is really important about the book. And it does seem that the Indian coffee house was a masculine space. And so when I first started doing oral histories, I would always ask the men that I interviewed, you know, were there women involved? Like, can you introduce me to the women who were part of this space? And they always said, oh, there were no women. And it's very hard to believe, right? Because we do know that there were, not only were there women who were key figures in the student movement, but particularly sort of in women's colleges in Delhi University, there were really active and vibrant movements against the emergency that were entirely led by women. And Subhashini Ali, for example, had women's spaces to organize against the emergency, not so much in Delhi, but in other places across India. And so it was always a puzzle to me how, you know, women were forgotten by the men who were leading this movement. And it wasn't, I guess, until Kumi Kapoor's memoir came out, where she details several times in the book about her husband and his role in sort of the coffee houses. And when you read very closely to the narrative, she's there with him. And it's kind of curious, even she sort of erases herself from this narrative in a sense. So, and when I, you know, interviewed her in person, she also focused more on sort of what her husband was doing versus what she was doing at the time. So it's, you know, so that in a way is curious. But of course, there's also Pramila Lewis's memoir where she talks about sort of her role in the coffee house movement. And so again, it's sort of a couple lines in passing. But so there are, I think that there are women, but it was, you know, it was difficult to trace them. And I also think that particularly when it comes to a lot of the more subversive activities that were taking place, like the Baroda dynamite conspiracy, for example, these were really small groups of male activists who, because of the subversive nature of what they were doing, had these very tight-knit relationships. And so I think that just by virtue of these very small all-male affinity groups, it was kind of exclusionary on some level too. And of course, I think a lot of the socialist activists in particular had a bit of a casual sexism, or maybe not so casual in some cases. So I do think that there was also, you know, a sexism in this movement in particular.
Right. I mean, I think that point is really interesting because there were lots of women in the left movement, but maybe they were not bringing questions of gender to the fore in a way that later, I think even the left movements had to, you know, sort of deal with. But when you talked about, you know, them not being involved because, especially in the more dangerous activities like making bombs, I mean, you can't help thinking that the movement before independence, which were also like little male clubs, but women were, you know, insisted on participating and opening up that space. So it's very interesting to think about what was considered okay for a woman to do and not during this movement. But I'm also thinking that part of the masculinism could be that some of the movements that fed into it, like the Bihar students movement, was definitely didn't give too much space to women activists. Is that right? Is that your sense of the Bihar students movement?
Yeah, that would be my sense. I mean, I do think that particularly this Gandhian socialist node was particularly sexist, but I think we could, you know, I think all of the left groups at this time could benefit from a bit reflexivity on this question.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, could we talk a little bit about JNU, which played such a crucial role, at least in Delhi, and also not just Delhi, but the significance could be national, because many of the participants in the protests against the emergency in JNU came from different parts of India, and you show some of the connections, you know, with Bihar, with UP, with other parts, with the South. So, you know, and here I want you to briefly talk about JNU and its place in the movement against the emergency, but also reflect on the importance of universities in that movement then and now. It's very interesting that in the last 2 years, JNU, more actually, 3-4 years, JNU has been again in the eye of the storm. And this both can speak to the particularity of JNU, but also to the place of students and intellectuals more generally in movements against repression, you know, which are one of the links that we can think about between the period that you're describing and what's going on now. But, you know, I just invite you to talk about both the connect and the disconnect of that.
Sure. So I think, yeah, I mean, the SFI JNU in particular was remarkably heroic during the emergency and had, I guess, one of the most vibrant movements in opposition to it. And I think that one of the things that we need to keep in mind in terms of the background to how the student movement became so vibrant during the emergency is that most of the party leadership was arrested the night of the emergency. So you had a situation where if protests were to happen, it would have to be by the student wings, because the more senior party leadership was mostly arrested on the night of the emergency. So it was really up to the students to take up that mantle. And we do see that there is a lot of, you know, regional diversity and connections. So one of the stories that I really liked is when I was interviewing DP Tripathi and Pravir Purkayastha, they both sort of independently told me that they were friends from back in Allahabad. And sort of they reconnected at JNU after being involved in SFI there. And so there are these sort of like more regional linkages that then are cemented when people are sort of then gaining admission in JNU. But I also think that it does go back to the history and the mission of the university in particular, and particularly its affinity with the left, with this kind of critical engagement, and you know that it also attracted a more unconventional, creative, bohemian sort of crowd. So there was this sort of way in which you could have these really sort of meaningful discussions and connections among students. But I also think it's important to keep in mind that Delhi University was also a hotbed of student protests at the time too. And also I think that my impression is that there were a lot of different party student wings that were really engaged. DP Tripathi, who was the SFJNU president at the time, was very in close conversation with Arun Jaitley, who was the head of the ABVP in Delhi University at the time. And so I think it's also important to note that part of the reason that the student movement was so successful is that there were these really unconventional alliances between particularly SFI and the ABVP, which was a very strange thing given the constellations of the present, to realize that they were in such close conversation, even to the point where when DPT and Arun Jaitley were both arrested as political prisoners, they were sharing a jail cell together, and they were sort of like coordinating, oh, this person should meet this person. And, you know, like they were still sort of running the student movement from behind bars in a way, but also doing it in tandem, which is strange to imagine today. And I know when I asked DP Tripathi about this, he said, well, you know, we were more concerned about the immediate objective, and we were able to put aside our differences and organize this movement against the emergency.
Yeah, I mean, two things come to mind. One is very simply, how did the jail experiences, could you talk a little bit, and you do in the book, how the prison as a place where, again, you know, it's not the coffee house, but again, it's a place where people are meeting across the political divides. And could you talk a little bit about how the people who were jailed thought of this space and as a space for their political education and also for building alliances? But, you know, talking about the Arun Jaitley and DPT being in the same cell, it's also true that a lot of the people among the BJP, what we now call the BJP, but the Jansangh and the RSS particularly, just apologized to the government and were keen to get out. I mean, whereas socialists did not and were subject to, you know, lots of torture and other kinds of repression in jail. So there are differences in the way that the left and the right reacted to imprisonment, and yet there seems to be also a conversation in prison. Could you talk about that briefly?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, so it does seem that there is this sort of, I think that for the BJP in particular, there was this initial shock. And so that was the real impression that I got of that there wasn't this sense that this could really happen to them. And so these were also the kind of right-wing activists were, you know, not accustomed to going to prison for political work. And so really, I think, disoriented by being arrested at this time. And as we know, and I think the historical record confirms this, that many BJP activists wrote letters and tried to get out and apologized. But there were a few who were more committed, and they really looked to the left for guidance on how to ride out this time in jail. And so you had particularly some people, figures like Rajkumar Jain in particular, were really active in jail and agitating for better conditions for political prisoners. And you had some BJP activists who got on board with these agitations for example, like very basic things like, you know, access to running water, cots, which weren't given to political prisoners initially. And so these agitations did involve some of the Hindu right. One of the more interesting things I found too is that for Jamaat-e-Islami, this was also, you know, like, I guess that in retrospect, some Jamaat-e-Islami activists see it as a big opportunity for them because they really were disconnected from the political scene altogether. And so for the first time, they were in conversation with other political groups. And so that was sort of a moment where for the first time in their organization's history after the emergency, they actually turned out in Indian elections. And so we can think about the right, this wasn't just sort of a big moment for the RSS or BJP as it is today, but also for other right-wing groups who are learning from the left and sort of having these kind of conversations and exchanges that they weren't able to have before the emergency took place. But there were also, as you said, a lot of divisions too.
Yeah, you know, I have sort of one question about something you mentioned again and again, but it's not really explored in the book. And I think given our very global moment, it's really important. At one point you write that many theorists point to the mid-1970s as a period in which the global South saw many democratic states tip into authoritarianism in the decades following their independence. And then you say globally this period coincides with the beginning of the terminal crisis of US hegemony. You know, we could say that the terminal crisis seems to be taking a long time and going on and on, right? But then you don't make the connections in the book, at least, between the international scene and this crisis and what happened in the emergency. And I would like you to talk about that, and then perhaps we can think about what's going on now, you know, the similar configurations. But so just starting with what was the connection between the international scene, particularly with the US and its politics, and what was going on in the emergency.
Yeah. No, I think that that's really important to kind of put it back in this macro perspective. And I do think it's a very long crisis. And I think that right now what we're seeing is, you know, sort of the ends of this current structural crisis playing out. And I think that that's why we are seeing this resurgence in authoritarianism in the current moment. But to get back to the 1970s, I think that what's really happening at this point is that this mid-war or this post-war compact around international development in particular is eroded, with sort of this global 1968 that in India is articulated through the Dalit Panthers, the Naxalites, the railway worker strike. You see this, you know, like many places in the world, you see this kind of massive resurgence in social movement activity that's happening around and in the aftermath of a global 1968. But then you also see sort of at the same time, the promises of economic development as, you know, envisioned by Harry Truman and others in that moment as the US is ascending to world power, you know, are not delivering the goods. And so a lot of world leaders are sort of left with these massive demands from various movements to realize the goals of national independence, but also of the promises of economic development. And it's not sustained and it's not being supported. And so you see that when, you know, more conventional means of assuaging these different movements aren't working, a lot of leaders are resorting to force. And so Indira Gandhi, I think, is just one of many world leaders at this point where is responding to these threats from below by revoking or suspending the constitution. And luckily, I guess for her, from her perspective, the Allahabad ruling gives her that opportunity to sort of really clamp down and to initiate the kind of economic development policies that she really wants to see. Because in the speech that she gives in arguing for emergency, some of the justifications that she gives is around, you know, the need to truly implement her economic development vision. And so I think that we really see in this moment that this global crisis leads to, you know, a very limited set of options on the behalf of leaders who are facing this threat from below.
Okay, thank you. There are questions from the audience. We could take those, or I could, yeah, let's take those, and then we can wrap up. You know, I could keep carrying on and on, you know, but let's address the questions which Qudsiya can actually come in and ask. Yes.
Great.
Yes. Just a second. I'll just pick up a few questions. Yeah, let me begin by the last one. I see that Anab Jafri, who's working on coffee shops in Lahore particularly, has a question for, I guess this is for both of you. Given that during the time period of India's emergency, Pakistan was experiencing a sedimentation of a more totalitarian state, was there any impact on this development in India and vice versa? And was there any flow of connection between the coffee houses in the two neighboring countries?
Great, thank you so much for that question. So yes, in fact, the coffee house in Lahore and the house in Delhi were part of the same chain in the 1930s. And so there was a, you know, explicit connection before independence to the coffee houses, or the coffee house in Lahore and the coffee house in Delhi. They were all part of the same Coffee Board of India. And then after independence, they experienced different trajectories. So in India, as is detailed in this book, they become cooperatives and then this real key site of resistance against the emergency. But you do see similar things in Lahore. So, you know, they're not part of a massive chain of cooperatives as they are in India, but they do become really key sites for artists and intellectuals and are nodes of resistance against the Zia coup. And yes, that is sort of my next book will detail that, and hopefully some of the research will be coming out soon, so you can look for that.
Oh.
Okay. Saida Masood is curious to know the sociological argument in the book, Kristin.
Okay, so that's a very big question. Thank you, Saida. So, I mean, I guess that the sociological argument would be around this particular take that I have on Fanon, and recovering Fanon as a political economist, I would say. And so, you know, to think about the theory aspect of this, the way that I see, you know, a lot of these, you know, I guess the way that I'm reading Fanon in the book in order to really understand what's happening from independence to the emergency is through his concepts of imperialism and a class analysis. So what I think is really interesting and what hasn't really come out, I think, in a lot of the English translations, because I do think that there is sort of a lot that gets lost with Fanon in translation in particular, is that, you know, he has on the one hand this sense of the way that imperialism is moving over the course of the 20th century from European imperialism to sort of a US neo-imperialism. But he's also coupling this with an analysis, a class analysis that looks at this transition from colonial rule and the domination by sort of colonial officials and colonial capital to the rule of the local bourgeoisie that sort of, you know, enacts this similar things. So while the characters are changing over the 20th century and with independence, the categories are staying the same. And so this kind of dialectical thinking about the relationship between imperialism and class analysis, I think, is particularly appealing, and hopefully comes out in the text in the way that I'm thinking about the interplay between global forces and the local class forces.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Kristin. There is a question from Bhashwati Chatterjee. She says, are you also talking about the coffee house in Calcutta and the discussions that were sort of led by the presidency college at that time?
So some of the oral history interviews that I did were with different activists who were originally from Calcutta. And they were always doing these implicit comparisons of the coffee house on College Street versus the Delhi coffee houses. The story is very much a Delhi-centric story, but then has these connections to India and beyond, and then to the global. And so there is parts of the text that capture sort of the, particularly for Calcuttaites, this sort of romance of the Calcutta coffee houses being a little bit more bohemian, I guess, than the coffee houses in Delhi. So, so that, I guess that's how I can speak to that question. So thanks for that.
Can I sort of jump in, because it struck me that even within Delhi, you really concentrate on the coffee house, which was in Connaught Place, because it became such an important sort of national center, you know, for various people to come together. But there were other such coffee houses even in Delhi. And the one on Delhi University in the Delhi School of Economics was quite famous for housing subterranean conversations. And, you know, I know several people who operated out of there, so to speak. You know, but they were more sort of student or teachers, whereas the coffee house in the center of the city did also have people who had nothing to do with universities. You know, they had political parties and so on. So maybe each coffee house also had a slightly different clientele and, who would come. But if you don't mind, I want to share an anecdote, which suddenly I remembered, but I think it's kind of really interesting for the history, which is that my own father was a political prisoner just after independence, and he was put into solitary confinement. He was then beaten up. Then they said they would put him in hospital, but chained. So he said, I refuse a hospital treatment if you're going to chain me to the bed. So after a while, they put him on parole, a kind of limited parole in Simla, where there, as you know, was a big coffee house, which you mentioned. And there he had to have a person with him, guarding him 24/7. But he would go to the coffee house, say, I'm going inside. And one of the conditions for his parole was, at that point, no political activity. But he would go to the coffee house, and the man who was supposedly guarding him would stay outside the coffee house. My father would go in, the workers would take him to the back from which he could escape, go do political activities, and come back to the coffee house where, and everybody knew, including the person who was put in charge of him, what was going on. So the coffee house workers clearly made this possible. Now, I had always just thought of this as a strange story that he told me when I was a child, but now I'm realizing that it was the coffee house workers who made possible this kind of activity. So.
Yeah. Okay, we'll take another question. Just a second. Yeah. So Parthu Chakrabarti is interested to know, your thoughts on how the discontent from below that you described as sort of widespread at that time internationally squares with Indira Gandhi's own popularity in India as a leader. And as a leader, did not that broad base become one of the reasons she was able to pull off a move like this, like emergency? And how do you generally see the link between authoritarianism and populism today in the current dispensation, the political center that we have?
So thanks for that question. I think that that's a really important thing to remember, that there are popular support for leaders that engage in authoritarian politics. One of, I think, the most interesting things that I came across in doing research for the book was a series of confidential memos between Indira Gandhi and her political advisor, P.N. Huxar. And one of the memos, Huxar details sort of a class analysis of Indira Gandhi's support on just after the emergency is declared. And it's interesting to see that the broadest base of support comes from the middle class. In the middle of the middle class. And so this was seen as sort of, I think that they really bought into this sort of law and order argument that was being pitched at the time. And there's also, the constant adage throughout the emergency through her supporters that, the trains ran on time and that, people, that there was sort of a rigidity that allowed for the facilitation of business and so on and so forth. And so there was sort of this broad-based support, but it really quickly eroded. And so when you see sort of, the memos over time, Huxar becomes very concerned that particularly sort of the forced sterilization program was something that, that lost the middle class, along with a lot of the stuff that was happening in the name of urban development and redevelopment. And so, so there was this sense that as long as there were benefits that were accrued to certain groups, that they would be on board. But, as like the more people kind of saw the adverse effects of what was happening, I think that support kind of became very quickly eroded. And then in terms of, authoritarianism in India today, like certainly there is sort of some support that, quite a great deal of support that Modi faces. related to the same tactics that authoritarian leaders across the globe are learning and are using. And I think it's interesting the way that different leaders are kind of learning from each other. And there does seem to be sort of this playbook to capture a very particular demographic and maintain support from that. So I think that there are these sort of class and other demographics of support that, that these leaders draw on.
Can I just follow up on this very important question? Do you see, what are your sort of thoughts on this difference that I think Parthu is drawing attention to between Modi's regime and Indira Gandhi's regime? So the Modi regime is constantly talking about the emergency. After all, there was the emergency and you're calling us dictatorial. I mean, this is a common theme, and we've had recently some articles and in-depth analysis about the emergency, talking about it as a precursor rather than something that is different. And so the support of the populism of authoritarian regimes, is there a difference between then and now? And I just wanted to remind you that even intellectuals, even painters, Indira is India and India is Indira. How many people lined up kind of behind that? So I agree with you that she made herself so unpopular through those the kind of moves that happened around sterilization and slum clearance and lack of freedom. But can you reflect on the lessons for us today, the differences, the overlap?
Yeah, sure. No, I think that that's really important. So I think that, when it comes to Modi, it seems like a lot of, clearly his base is in the Hindu right and in Hindu nationalism. And so he's stoking a lot of both caste and communal tension in order to sort of fire up his base and maintain a certain power. And so I think that in a lot of popular analysis that I've read, the thing that sort of I push back against the most is that there is this sense that, well, at least the emergency didn't target Muslims and Dalits. But that's not the case. And especially if you look at the, particularly the confidential correspondence between Indira Gandhi and P.N. Huxar, Huxar is really concerned that particularly the forced sterilization are disproportionately targeting Muslims. There's horrible stories that come out, particularly sort of in Haryana and in UP, where entire villages are sort of at gunpoint being marched into family planning camps, and the people being rounded up are Muslims and Dalits. And so Huxar is saying to Indira Gandhi, not so much because he cares about the human toll of this, but he's like, you're going to lose elections if you keep doing this, because everyone knows that these are the groups being targeted. And this also comes to a head in Turkmen Gate in 1976, when, again, the family planning program takes on this kind of fanatical character in the neighborhood around Turkmen Gate, and people start resisting. And that, I think, is also, in addition to SFI-JNU, is one of the most significant uprisings against the emergency. And by some accounts, almost 1,500 people were killed that day. And so, it's hard to really say that the emergency didn't have a caste and communal character to it. But of course, what's happening today, which was unlike the emergency, is Indira Gandhi wasn't targeting certain political parties or trying to evoke certain Hindu religious sentiments in order to fire people up in favor of the emergency. It was really framed as an issue of sort of, economic development and prosperity and rationality. And it was sort of like, it had this very modernist character. And so what we see in the rhetoric around Modi, that's being sort of like, that he's using is really sort of in order to create these kinds of tensions, to sort of divide and conquer in a way. But there are these longer connections between the way that, the emergency sort of disproportionately targeted certain groups and sort of what's happening today in India.
Kutsia, I see a question in a different format, not on this, which is from Nick Millman. I'm going to just read this out. He asks, trying to think about the recent uptake of the autonomous zones globally, from Rojava to the Zapatistas to the one in Seattle. And the example of the coffee house provided in this study, can you talk a little more about the temporality of the autonomous zone? Is one way to disaggregate this term through the expectation as a permanent or strategically temporary practice? How does the idea of the autonomous zone change across rural and urban geographies? I see that as a very interesting and important question, actually. So.
Yeah, no, definitely. I think that that is a really important question, and it kind of is really fitting given the previous question, because then it sort of brings us back into, so then what do we do about this? And I do think that when we think about the autonomous zone, temporality is key. And I think that that's sort of, what I was gesturing at earlier in the conversation about the difference between the autonomous zone and then it's tipping into a movement in these certain moments. And so I think that there are these moments where different forums that bring people together to have these kinds of conversations, and also to really envision possibilities and to try to enact them in a very small scale, become really important in moments of state repression. And so in that sense that they are sort of temporally limited, because they usually do get eviscerated. As we're seeing sort of in the US around this in particular right now, that they have this life where they sort of become visible, and there's this kind of moment in which they enact and envision a certain kind of utopian politics, but then because they are so visible and because they are real physical places, they're open to police repression. And that's, I think, what we're seeing on the West Coast of the United States right now. But I think that in that moment, they also have the ability to live on. And I think that the examples of Rojava and the Zapatista movement are really key in showing how these spaces can really capture popular imagination for decades to come, even if they burn out really quickly in the face of state repression. So they live on by having different articulations in different spaces, in different times and geographies.
Okay, so I think we could take one last question, Anvesha Ghosh's question before we wind up. She says, could you tell us a little more about the modalities of the cooperative as an institution and how that played a role in this narrative?
Sure. So yeah, the cooperative was this tactic, I think, that initially started out as a compromise between at that point, I guess it was A.K. Gopalan and Nehru who were really leading this deliberation over what the coffee houses would be. And the rank and file of the Indian coffee house workers weren't terribly keen on the idea of a cooperative to begin with, because they really wanted to become a state-owned firm as they were during the British Raj. But they saw this as sort of, because they had occupied and appropriated the firm, by being a state-owned firm after independence, they could really enact this kind of state socialism that they had as their template. But the way that things, I guess, evolved as the coffee houses grew as a firm was that there were sort of these regional nodes in which there was more local control of the firm. So on the level of the cooperative, you have sort of worker owners who are in each individual location, and then worker owners that get elected to sort of like regional branches of the firm, and then the broader structure beyond that. So I think that what's impressive for the Indian coffee house as a cooperative versus other cooperatives is the scale. This is sort of a national chain of cafes that is being managed by worker owners.
Sure. So, Anya, do you have more questions for Kristin here?
I think we've bombarded her enough.
Yeah.
Maybe she has things to add which she hasn't been asked. That might be.
Yeah. Yeah, and that's the reason we kept the last word for Kristin, so that she could just nicely wrap up.
All right, so I'll conclude by thanking Ania and Kutsia and everyone else for all of their work in organizing the event and participating in and helping create this really vibrant conversation, and to all the who made time wherever it is in the world that you are, whether it's late or early or in the middle of the day, for coming and being a part of the conversation. And I just want to, I guess, conclude by saying that, you know, I hope that that through this book, you know, we can really think about not just sort of remembering the past and sort of the contributions of the Indian left in particular to, you know, pushing back against this really dark period in Indian history, and to really remember sort of, you know, what happened and the sacrifices that different actors made in this moment, but also to help us think about how do we organize against authoritarian rule when it is a really difficult issue, because, you know, you have on the one hand state repression that makes it harder to push back, but it also makes it even more necessary. So I hope that, you know, readers will take up that challenge and help me think through, you know, ways in which we can push back against authoritarianism and all of its different articulations in the current moment by learning from the example of those who led the resistance against the emergency.
All right. Yeah. So on that wonderful note, thank you, everyone. Thank you, Ania. Thank you, Kristin, for this really wonderful discussion. I think we couldn't have made it more engaging. I mean, especially by picking up on certain contemporary developments, you know, how sites in India particularly are becoming major sites for resistance, universities, JNU, Jamia. I think, you know, the kind of movement that we've seen, particularly post December 2019, I think that's, I mean, those are several reasons why this book becomes important, because it's a great lesson for how do we continue our movement to face power like this. All right. Thank you very much. Thank you everyone for joining in. Thank you once again.